The moment Gideon Dawson heard her voice drifting through the open door of the Millhaven General Store, something inside his chest shifted in a way it had never shifted before, not in 32 years of living rough and working hard beneath the wide Texas sky. It was the autumn of 1878, and the Texas Panhandle was breathing its last gasps of summer heat, the kind that clung to a man's collar and made the cattle restless and the horses mean. Gideon had ridden into the town of Millhaven that Tuesday morning with a single practical purpose firmly lodged in his mind, the way a man lodges a boot into a stirrup and commits to the climb. His ranch, the Double D, sat 12 miles east of town along a stretch of red dirt road that wound through mesquite and live oak, and the house that sat on that land had been suffering from the prolonged absence of a woman's steady hand for nearly 2 years now. Since his housekeeper, old Mrs. Tillman, had packed her belongings into a flour sack and gone to live with her daughter in San Antonio, the place had been sliding toward ruin in the quiet, relentless way that neglected things do. Dishes stacked in a manner that suggested geological layering, curtains that had given up any pretense of color, a kitchen floor that had developed a personality of its own, sticky in places he could not explain, and gritty in places he preferred not to investigate. His ranch hand, a wiry old man named Clem Hooper who had been with the Double D since before Gideon had inherited it from his father, had taken to leaving his meals on the porch rather than step inside. "You need a housekeeper, boss," Clem had said that very morning, adjusting the brim of his hat against the early sun. "Place smells like a saddle blanket left in the rain." Gideon had not argued, because Clem was right, and because arguing with Clem about domestic matters was as pointless as arguing with the wind about direction. So he had saddled his bay gelding, Ranger, and ridden into Millhaven with the intention of posting a notice at the general store and perhaps speaking with the widow Hartley, who was known to know everyone in the county and their business twice over. He would find someone sensible and capable, pay a fair wage, and ride home before the afternoon heat settled in. That was the plan. It was a good, practical plan, and Gideon Dawson was a practical man. He had not planned on her. He heard the voice before he saw the face. It came out of the general store as he was tying Ranger to the hitching post, threading through the warm morning air like a melody someone had set free from a music box and left to find its own way. It was not a singing voice, though there was music in it. It was a speaking voice, low and clear, with a cadence that suggested the speaker chose her words the way a careful person chooses stepping stones across a creek, deliberate and sure, but with a grace that made the deliberateness invisible. "I understand, Mr. Holloway, truly I do," the voice was saying. "But I am afraid I cannot take credit for what 3 pounds of good flour and honest technique will produce on their own. The bread either rises or it does not, and no amount of flattery to the baker changes the nature of yeast." There was a low chuckle from what Gideon recognized as old Tom Holloway's voice, the store owner, a man not given to chuckling under ordinary circumstances. Gideon stepped through the doorway. She was standing at the counter with her back partially turned to him, one hand resting lightly on a wrapped parcel that sat between herself and Tom Holloway. She was perhaps 27 or 28. With dark auburn hair pinned up beneath a faded bonnet that she had clearly worn so many seasons, it had softened into something comfortable rather than fashionable. Her dress was clean but simple, a calico of faded blue and cream, the kind a woman wore when she meant to work and did not intend to impress anyone with the fact that she was working. Her shoulders were straight, not stiffly so, but with the natural straightness of a person who had decided at some point in their life not to apologize for taking up space. She turned slightly when Gideon's boots struck the wooden floor, and he caught her profile. A firm jaw, a nose that had character to it, eyes that he could not quite determine the color of from this angle, but which seemed to be doing a great deal of looking in a very quiet way. "Morning," Tom Holloway said, looking past the woman to Gideon. "Mr. Dawson, what can I do for you?" Gideon opened his mouth to answer, but the woman had half-turned now, offering a polite acknowledgement of his presence with a slight inclination of her head, and her eyes met his for a fraction of a second, and he saw that they were a clear hazel, the kind that shifts between green and brown depending on the light, and in the morning light coming through the store's front window they were very nearly gold. "Morning," he managed. "Tom, I need to post a notice." "What kind of notice?" Tom asked, already reaching under the counter for a slip of paper and the stub of a pencil he kept there. "Housekeeper," Gideon said, "for the Double D 12 miles out. Live-in position. Good wage." There was the briefest pause from the woman at the counter, so brief that Gideon was not sure he had not imagined it, and then she gathered her parcel and turned fully toward the door, and as she passed him she said, in that low, clear voice that had found its way through the air to him before he had even laid eyes on her, "Good morning, sir." And she was out the door and into the sunlight before he thought to say good morning back. Tom Holloway was watching him with the mild expression of a man who has lived long enough to recognize certain kinds of distraction on a person's face. "That's Augusta Prescott," Tom said, "Widow Parsons' niece. She's been staying out at the widow's place on Sycamore Street these past 4 months. "Is she?" Gideon said. It was not quite a question. He watched the door for a moment longer than was entirely necessary, then turned back to the counter and the business of the notice. He dictated the terms to Tom, who wrote them out in his careful, block-letter hand, and they tacked the paper to the board beside the door where notices for lost horses and church socials and rooms for rent competed for the eye's attention. Gideon bought a sack of coffee and a tin of tobacco and exchanged a few words about cattle prices and the likely weather, and then he untied Ranger and started home. He told himself, riding back along the red dirt road with the wind picking up from the west, that he was thinking about the fence line on the north pasture that Clem had said needed looking at, and about the water situation at the south well, and about the price of beef that had not been as favorable as he would have liked at the last drive. He was not thinking about her voice, except that he was. He could still hear it, clear and precise, the way a bell sounds after you have walked away from the church, still ringing in the air just behind your thoughts. I am afraid I cannot take credit for what 3 pounds of good flour and honest technique will produce on their own. The bread either rises or it does not. Ranger snorted and shook his head, and Gideon realized he had slackened the reins without noticing. "Mind yourself," he told the horse, which was really a thing he was telling himself. By the time the Double D came into view, its white-painted fences weathered to the color of old cream, and the house sitting square and solid against the sky with the pecan tree in the yard dropping its first autumn leaves, Gideon had made a quiet internal accounting of the situation and arrived at a sensible conclusion. He had heard an interesting voice. It was not the first interesting thing he had ever encountered in the world, and it would not be the last. He was a grown man with a ranch to run and a housekeeper to find, and he did not have the time or the inclination to be distracted by the voice of a woman he did not know and would likely never speak to again. He unsaddled Ranger and turned him out to pasture, and he went inside, and he stood in his dim, dusty kitchen, and he listened to the silence of the house, which was a different kind of silence now than it had been that morning, and he thought about her voice, and he was not entirely sure why, but he could not make himself stop. 3 days passed. Clem had taken to humming tunelessly while he worked, which was a sure sign that he had formed an opinion about something and was waiting to be asked. Gideon did not ask, because Gideon already knew what the opinion was, and also because he was not entirely ready to have a conversation about it. The notice in Tom Holloway's store window produced 2 inquiries. The first was a Mrs. Blanche Kowalski, a heavy-set woman of about 50 with capable hands and a forthright manner, who came to the ranch on Wednesday afternoon and walked through every room of the house with an expression that moved between resigned and appalled. She asked sensible questions about the wage and the expected duties and the nature of the household, which amounted to one rancher, one elderly ranch hand who took most of his meals in the bunkhouse, and occasionally several other hands during branding or roundup season. She said she would think on it and let him know, and she rode back to town on a sturdy mule, and Gideon thought that she would probably be fine and that he should feel relieved. He did not feel relieved. The second inquiry came on Thursday, in the form of a girl of perhaps 18 who arrived accompanied by her mother, and who spent the entire visit looking at her shoes and answering every question with a whispered yes or no that suggested she was more terrified than willing. Her mother did most of the talking, in a cheerful rapid-fire manner that reminded Gideon of hail on a tin roof. He thanked them both kindly and said he would be in touch, and he meant it in the way that means he would not. On Thursday evening, Gideon sat on the porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he was not drinking it, watching the stars come out over the Panhandle one by one, the way they always did, each one claiming its particular square of sky with quiet authority, and he thought that a man could spend a great deal of energy trying not to think about something and accomplish very little. He rode back into Millhaven on Friday morning. He told himself he needed more coffee. He did not need more coffee. He had bought an ample supply on Tuesday. But the coffee was a useful reason, and he had long since learned that useful reasons are worth having. Tom Holloway's store was quiet when he arrived, the middle of the morning being a slow time. Tom was behind the counter rearranging a display of tinned goods with the concentration of a man who finds order deeply satisfying. He looked up when Gideon came in and nodded. "Morning again," Tom said. "Coffee." "If you have the good kind," Gideon said. Tom reached for the tin on the shelf behind him. "Had a couple more folks asking about your notice," he said. "Wrote down their names." Gideon set his hands on the counter and looked at the list Tom produced. 2 more names. He did not recognize either of them, and he was about to say so when the door opened behind him, and he heard a voice he recognized immediately, with a recognition that surprised him by its certainty. "Good morning, Tom," Augusta Prescott said. "My aunt is asking whether you received the bolt of Navy serge she ordered. She is beginning to worry it was lost." "Just came in yesterday," Tom said, reaching under the counter. "Was going to send word." Gideon turned. She was wearing a different dress today. A green one this time, simpler than the blue, with her bonnet hanging by its ribbons down her back, because the day was not yet hot enough to require it. Without the bonnet, her hair was more visible, the auburn of it catching the morning light in a way that confirmed it was genuinely that color and not something the light had invented on Tuesday. She was holding a small basket over one arm, the kind used for errands, and she was looking at Tom with the focused attention of someone who has come to accomplish a specific thing and intends to accomplish it efficiently. Then she noticed Gideon, and her gaze moved to him with a calm and unhurried interest that he found immediately interesting. "Good morning," she said. The same phrase she had offered on Tuesday, but because it was her voice, it carried that quality of being precisely meant. "Good morning, Miss Prescott," he said, and then caught himself because he had not been introduced to her on Tuesday and therefore had no business knowing her name, and he saw her register this with a slight shift of her expression, not quite amusement but in the neighborhood of it. "You have the advantage of me," she said. "You know my name, but I do not know yours." "Gideon Dawson," he said. "The Double D Ranch, 12 miles east. Tom mentioned your name when you were here Tuesday." "Ah," she said. And then, with that quality of directness that he was beginning to suspect was simply characteristic of her, she said, "The Double D, that is the ranch seeking a housekeeper." "It is," he said. She nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already thought about, and then turned back to Tom to take receipt of the bolt of serge, which Tom was wrapping in brown paper with the efficient movements of a man who has wrapped 1,000 things. Gideon should have moved away, should have concluded his business and let her conduct hers, but he found himself standing at the counter long enough for her to finish with Tom, take her wrapped serge, and turn back toward the door. "Mr. Dawson," she said, pausing beside him, "if you have not yet filled the position, I would like to inquire about it, if that is appropriate." He looked at her for a moment. The hazel eyes were direct and steady, and he could see now that there was something in them that suggested a history of difficulty navigated without complaint, the kind of quietly earned self-possession that only comes from having had to find one's own footing more than once. "It's appropriate," he said. "I haven't filled it yet." "Then perhaps we could speak," she said, "at a time that is convenient." "I can speak now," he said, "if you have time." "I have time," she said, and set her basket on the counter, and they sat in the two chairs that Tom kept near the cold stove for just such purposes of conversation, though Tom's attempts to appear absorbed in his tinned goods arrangement were not entirely convincing. Gideon told her about the ranch. The house was a 4-bedroom frame house, solidly built, with a good kitchen and a root cellar and a small garden that had gone to weeds but could be revived. There was a bunkhouse for the hands, so she would not be troubled with a house full of men. The main household was himself, and occasionally when the rheumatism was bad, Clem Hooper, who was 61 and as likely to cause trouble as a fence post. The duties were cooking, cleaning, managing the household provisions, doing the household laundry, and attending to whatever general maintenance the inside of the house required. The wage was $15 a month, which was fair for the territory and the time, plus room and board. She listened to all of this with her hands folded in her lap, and that quality of genuine attention that made a person feel that what they were saying was actually being heard. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I should be honest with you, Mr. Dawson," she said. "I prefer that," he said. "I have been here 4 months staying with my aunt," she said. "Before that I was in Abilene, Kansas, where my husband and I had a small dry goods business. My husband, Robert Prescott, died of cholera 18 months ago. The business had debts. When those were settled, there was not much left, and I came here because my aunt was kind enough to offer shelter while I found my footing again." She said this plainly, without self-pity, and without the particular kind of bravado that self-pity tries to disguise itself as. "My aunt's house is small, and my presence there is a kindness she can ill afford indefinitely, though she would never say so. I need employment, and I am capable of the work you are describing. I'm a good cook, I am not afraid of hard work, and I am reliable. Those are my qualifications." Gideon looked at her for a moment. "How old are you?" he asked. 28, she said, "and you have no concerns about the arrangement, living at the ranch." "I am a widow," she said with a slight lift of her chin, "not a girl. I am practical about what my circumstances require. The question I would ask is whether your own conduct warrants the arrangement being a respectable one." He almost smiled at that. It was so precisely said. "I run a respectable house," he said. "The position would be what I described, nothing else." Nodded. "Then I have no concerns. Can you start Monday?" he asked. "I can start Monday," she said. He rode home that afternoon with the coffee he had bought as his excuse, and Clem was sitting on the fence near the barn and watched him dismount with the expression of a man who has been waiting for something. "You find someone?" Clem asked. "I did," Gideon said. "Good cook, she says she is." Clem turned this over for a moment. "She, Mrs. Augusta Prescott," Gideon said. "Widow, 28. From Abilene originally. She starts Monday." Clem was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right then," in the tone of a man who has decided to observe developments before forming a full opinion, which for Clem was practically restraint. That evening, in the silence of the house, Gideon sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and wrote a list of things that needed to be addressed before Monday, things like cleaning out the room that would be hers, which was the bedroom at the back of the house that had been used for storage since Mrs. Tillman's departure. He made the list carefully and precisely, and then he sat with the pencil in his hand and listened to the quiet, and he admitted to himself, in the honest interior way of a man alone with the night, that he had not gone back to Millhaven for coffee. He was not sure what that meant. He was not sure he was ready to find out what it meant. But he had heard her voice, and then he had found reasons to hear it again. And now she was coming to his house on Monday, and the idea of that, the simple domestic reality of it, filled some particular hollow in the silence of the house that he had not previously known was hollow. Monday came the way Mondays in October always do in the Texas Panhandle, with a sky so blue it looks newly made and a wind that carries the first real promise of winter underneath the last warmth of fall. Gideon had been up since before dawn, which was normal, but he had spent considerably longer than necessary ensuring that the kitchen was in a presentable state, which was not. Augusta Prescott arrived at 8 o'clock in the morning in the widow Parsons' wagon, driven by a boy of 14 who was the widow's neighbor's son, and who had been paid in biscuits to make the trip. She brought with her a single trunk, a carpet bag, and a large covered pot that turned out, when Gideon offered to carry it inside and felt the weight of it, to contain an already prepared beef stew. "I thought," she said, taking the pot back from him with the quiet authority of a woman who knows where things should go even in a house she has not yet seen, "that the first day would be spent learning the house, and it made sense not to spend that time also worrying about supper." "That's practical," he said. "I find practicality useful," she said, and carried the pot into the kitchen, where she set it on the stove and lit the burner with the ease of a woman who has managed enough stoves to be on comfortable terms with all of them. She spent the morning moving through the house with the quiet, systematic thoroughness of a person conducting a careful survey. She opened cupboards and looked into corners and lifted curtains, and examined the state of the root cellar and the pantry and the back porch, all with that focused, unhurried attention, making small notes in a pocket notebook she kept in her apron, which she had put on over her dress within 20 minutes of arriving. She asked Gideon questions, direct and specific, about what provisions were on hand, what he expected to happen with the garden, whether there were regular delivery days from the store in town, and what his preferences were regarding meals. "I'm not a difficult man at the table," he told her, which was true. Years of eating whatever was available had cured him of particular opinions about food. "Everyone has some preferences," she said. "It is easier to know them than to discover them." "Coffee in the morning," he said, "strong, and I'm not fond of boiled cabbage." She wrote these down with the seriousness of someone accepting commissions. "Good. Boiled cabbage is an insult to the vegetable anyway," she said, and he did, this time, actually smile. She had that room set to rights by the afternoon. She had found a broom and used it with an energy that raised a dust cloud visible from the yard, causing Clem, who happened to be passing by the side of the house, to stop and peer through the window with the expression of a man watching something he had not expected to see in his lifetime. By the time the light was going golden in the west, the kitchen floor had been scrubbed. The curtains in the main room had been taken down to be washed in the morning. A list of needed provisions had been compiled and was sitting on the kitchen table. And the stew was warming and smelling like something that had been made with real care, with onion and carrot and the deep savory richness that comes from browning the meat properly first. Clem appeared at the kitchen door at supper time with the expression of a man who has decided to investigate. "Evening," he said. "Good evening, Mr. Hooper," Augusta said, not turning from the stove. "I have heard you take most of your meals in the bunkhouse. You are welcome to supper here tonight if you like." Clem looked at Gideon, who was sitting at the table with his coffee, with an expression that said he was revising his earlier position of observation and forming a preliminary opinion. "Don't mind if I do," Clem said, and pulled out a chair. The stew was, as Gideon had suspected it would be on the basis of no evidence beyond the smell, excellent. There was also cornbread, which she had made in the hour before supper in the cast-iron skillet, golden and fine-crumbed, the kind that does not need butter to justify its existence, though butter makes it transcendent. Clem ate 2 bowls and said nothing, which from Clem was the highest possible form of praise. After supper, Gideon offered to help with the dishes, which seemed to surprise her slightly. "That is not necessary," she said. "I know it isn't," he said, and picked up a dish towel, and she looked at him for a moment with those hazel eyes and then turned back to the wash basin, and they did the dishes together in a comfortable quiet that was unlike the silence of the house had been before she came, because this quiet had another person in it. That was the beginning. October settled into its rhythms, and Augusta Prescott settled into the double D with the same quiet inevitability. She was up every morning before Gideon, which he discovered on the third day when he came downstairs to find the coffee already made, and the kitchen already warm and her at the table with her own cup and that pocket notebook, making her morning lists. She did not look startled to see him, only moved to pour his coffee before he could reach the pot, and set it on the table and went back to her notebook. "You're up early," he said. "I am always up early," she said. "I sleep lightly, and I find mornings useful." "So do I," he said, and sat down with his coffee, and they were quiet together in the early morning, the way people are quiet together when they have grown comfortable enough not to need speech to fill a room. The garden was a project she took up with a focused energy that astonished him. It had been a good kitchen garden once, under Mrs. Tillman's care, with raised beds for herbs and kitchen vegetables along the south side of the house. 2 years of neglect had allowed the grass to reclaim most of it, and the beds had gone hard and weedy. Augusta began working it on her second Saturday, with the methodical patience of someone who understands that restoration is slower than destruction. Gideon found himself helping. He told himself it was simply because there were things in the garden that required more force than she could reasonably apply on her own, roots that had to be levered out, boards that needed to be replaced. This was true as far as it went. It did not go entirely far enough. They worked in the garden together on Saturday afternoons for the next 3 weekends, not talking a great deal because the work was absorbing, but occasionally saying things, the way people do when they are engaged in a shared physical task, and a thought rises to the surface, and it seems natural to let it out rather than keep it contained. She told him she had grown up in Missouri, outside of Springfield, on a small farm. She had gone to Kansas when she married at 22. Robert Prescott had been a decent man, she said, with a practical emphasis on the word decent that suggested she had measured him honestly and found him neither more nor less than what he was. She had been fond of him. His death had been sudden and terrible and had left her in circumstances she had not expected, and she had managed those circumstances with the resources available, which meant her aunt in Millhaven. He told her about the ranch. His father had built it in 1861 before the war, and Gideon had grown up on it and gone to war from it at 17 and come back to it at 19, which were 2 years of his life he did not talk about in any particular detail, but which had left their marks in the particular way that wars leave marks on young men. His father had died in 1872, leaving him the ranch, and he had run it since. He had never married. She looked at him when he said this, not with the particular curiosity that some women brought to the subject of a bachelor of his age, but with a quieter kind of interest, as if she were simply adding the information to what she understood about him. "No particular reason?" she asked, "or reasons you prefer not to say?" "No particular reason," he said. "It just never happened." She accepted this. "Some things happen on their own schedule," she said, and went back to pulling weeds. He thought about that later in the way he was beginning to think about things she said, carrying them around for a while to see what they yielded. In November, the weather changed. The Panhandle winter came down from the north like a curtain being drawn, sudden and complete, with a norther that arrived on a Wednesday and dropped the temperature 40 degrees in 6 hours. The cattle had to be moved to the winter pasture, and Gideon and the 2 hands he kept on through winter, Clem and a younger man named Pete Rafferty who had come on in the spring, spent 2 days in the cold and wind doing it. Augusta kept the house warm and the coffee hot and the food ready, and on the first evening of the norther, when Gideon came in cold to the bone and so tired his hands were shaking slightly, she set a bowl of soup in front of him without being asked and without commentary, simply because it was what was needed, and he sat at the kitchen table and ate it and felt the cold leaving him by degrees, and looked across the table at her where she sat with her own supper, and thought that the house felt, for the first time in years, like a place someone actually lived in rather than a place a man slept in between the larger business of working. "Thank you," he said, "for this." "The soup," she said. "For all of it," he said. He meant the house, and she seemed to understand that he meant the house, and she looked at him for a moment with those hazel eyes that were particularly warm in the lamplight, and she said, "You're welcome, Mr. Dawson," and went back to her supper. He noticed that he was still calling her Mrs. Prescott, and she was still calling him Mr. Dawson, and he noticed that this felt increasingly like a formality that both of them were maintaining out of propriety rather than preference, and the distance between propriety and preference was a distance he thought about more than was probably wise. The thing was, he could not stop hearing her voice. This was the particular difficulty of his situation, the fact that he had been living with it now for over a month, and it had not lessened but grown more present. She spoke, and he listened, not because he had to, but because the sound of it did something to his attention that he could not account for in any practical terms. She had a way of saying things that made them sound exactly true, not blunt but precise, as if she had found the exact right word and placed it exactly right, like a person setting a stone in a wall so it sits perfectly, needing no mortar to stay. She sang sometimes, in the kitchen when she thought no one could hear. Not full songs, just fragments, half-remembered hymns or soft, wordless melodies that she carried in her breath while she was working, and let out without seeming to notice. He heard it on a November morning when he was on the porch with his coffee, the wind carrying it through the gap in the kitchen window she had opened slightly despite the cold, because she said the heat of baking made the kitchen airless. He stood on the porch and listened to it and did not move until it stopped, and then he stood a moment longer in the quiet, and then he went inside to work. Clem had noticed. Clem noticed everything, and filtered it through the slow patience of a man who had lived 61 years in the world and formed his opinions carefully. He said nothing directly, because Clem's approach to sensitive subjects was the approach of a man who walks around a deep pool rather than jumping into it. But he made small observations that were shaped like nothing in particular but pointed in a direction. One afternoon in mid-November, Clem was sitting on the porch mending a harness when Gideon came out of the house, and Clem said, without looking up from his work, "Fine thing, a house with some life in it." "It is," Gideon said. "Mrs. Prescott makes good biscuits," Clem said. "She does," Gideon said. Clem mended in silence for a moment. "Good woman," he said. "Practical." "She is," Gideon said. "Shame to lose a good woman," Clem said with the absolute focus of a man who is thinking about nothing except harness stitching, when a man has the means to keep her around. Gideon looked at him. Clem looked at the harness. Gideon went back inside, the means to keep her around. He turned this over as he moved through the house that afternoon, doing the small necessary indoor tasks of a ranch in winter, checking the stove in the parlor, looking at the window frame in the sitting room that needed to be recaulked before it let in any more cold. Augusta was in the kitchen and he could hear her moving, the soft sounds of a person occupied in useful work, the particular quiet industry of her, and he stood in the sitting room with the caulk knife in his hand and thought, with a clarity that surprised him by arriving all at once rather than by degrees, that he did not want her to leave. Not in a month when her situation might change. Not in a year when she might find another position or another life. He did not want her to go, and the reason he did not want her to go had nothing to do with the kitchen floor or the curtains or the excellent biscuits or any other practical consideration he could have offered to himself as justification. It had to do with the way the house sounded when she was in it, and the way she sat across the table from him in the mornings with her coffee and her notebook, and the way her voice moved through the air with that quality of being exactly itself, and the way she had looked at him in the lamplight and said, "You're welcome, Mr. Dawson," and made it sound like something more than courtesy. He did not know what to do with this. He was not a man who was practiced in matters of the heart, not because he was indifferent to them, but because he had spent so many years being practical that the emotional interior of his life had developed its own kind of silence, the silence of things that are present but not spoken about. He thought about it for another 2 weeks, which was his habit with things that mattered. He did not rush to conclusions, and he did not act on things before he had thought them through. But when he finally arrived at the conclusion, he arrived at it with the same certainty with which he arrived at all his considered conclusions, which was to say, completely. He was in love with Augusta Prescott. He was in love with her voice and her practicality, and the way she argued with boiled cabbage, and the way she made the house feel inhabited, and the way she looked at things with those hazel eyes that missed nothing, and the way she had told him about her circumstances without self-pity and asked him directly about his conduct, and the way she sang in the kitchen when she thought no one could hear. He was 32 years old and he had never been in love before, and he had not expected it to feel like this, so solid and quiet, like something that had always been there and was only now being named. He had expected it, if it ever came, to feel more turbulent. But this felt like the way the land looks after a good rain, changed and clarified, everything more itself. The question was what to do about it, and the answer was not simple, because she was employed by him, which meant that anything he said or did had a dimension of imbalance that he was not comfortable with, the imbalance of a man in his own house speaking to a woman who needed the position and the wage. He did not want her to feel that her situation required her to respond to him in any particular way. He wanted, whatever happened, to happen freely. He was still thinking about this on the December evening when the problem arrived in the form of Franklin Morse. Franklin Morse was 38 years old, a land buyer from Fort Worth who had been moving through the Panhandle for several months, acquiring property from ranchers who were having difficult seasons. He was the kind of man who wore his prosperity visibly, in a good coat and well-heeled boots, and a manner that suggested he expected rooms to rearrange themselves for his comfort. He had been trying to buy parcels of land adjoining the Double D for 6 months, and Gideon had declined twice in writing and once in person, because the land in question was land he was not willing to sell, as it controlled the access to the south well. Morse arrived at the Double D on a Tuesday afternoon uninvited, which was itself an indication of his expectations about how the world was organized. He rode up in a wagon with a man Gideon did not recognize, and he knocked on the front door, which people rarely did because the back door was the one that was used. Augusta answered the door, because Gideon was in the barn with Clem addressing a problem with one of the wagon wheels, and Gideon did not know any of this was happening until Pete Rafferty came to the barn and said, with the expression of someone delivering news he is not sure how to classify, "There's a gentleman up at the house, boss. Mrs. Prescott's been talking to him for a while." Gideon walked to the house, and when he came in through the back, he heard voices in the parlor, and he heard Augusta's voice among them with a particular quality that he had not heard from it before, a flatness, a careful and deliberate neutrality of tone that he had learned, in 2 months of listening to her voice, meant that she was holding something else very carefully in place. He went into the parlor. Morse was sitting in the armchair by the fireplace as if it were his own chair, with the posture of a man who sits in the best seat in every room he enters. His companion, a silent, heavy-set man with the look of hired practicality, was standing by the door. Augusta was sitting across from Morse on the settee, with her hands folded in her lap, and that expression of composed neutrality that he now understood was what she did instead of showing what she was actually feeling. Morse looked up when Gideon came in. "Ah, Dawson," he said, as if they were at a business meeting that Gideon had arrived slightly late to. "Good. We were just having a conversation while waiting for you." "Mr. Morse," Gideon said. He looked at Augusta. She met his eyes with that steady gaze, and he could see something in it that was close to relief. I wasn't aware I was expecting company. I apologize for the informality, Morse said, in a tone that suggested he did not find informality particularly worth apologizing for. I was in the area and I wanted to make another offer on that south pasture land. Reasonable one this time, I think you'll agree. I've made my position on that land clear, Gideon said. Morse leaned forward with the easy confidence of a man who believes that the right number, applied at the right moment, solves most disagreements. I think you might feel differently when you hear the figure. I don't think I will, Gideon said. That land controls my Southwell access. Selling it would be commercially irrational. Morse's expression shifted slightly, the slight recalibration of a man who has encountered an answer he did not plan for. Then he looked toward Augusta with a kind of smooth social redirection. Your housekeeper and I were having a fine conversation while I waited, he said. Very capable woman. I was telling her that a woman of her qualities might have a number of options available to her. The air in the room changed in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Gideon looked at Augusta. Augusta looked at Gideon with those hazel eyes, and what was in them now was something he recognized, because he had seen it in the eyes of people who were accustomed to having their situations defined for them by others, and had decided at some point to stop permitting it. Mrs. Prescott's situation is entirely her own concern, Gideon said. His voice was even, but there was something in it that apparently communicated itself clearly, because the heavy-set man by the door straightened slightly, as if updating his assessment of the situation. Of course, Morse said smoothly. I meant no offense, simply making conversation. He rose from the armchair with the ease of a man changing tactics as smoothly as he changes clothes. Think about the offer, Dawson. It's generous. I'll leave the figure with you. He set a folded piece of paper on the table, and then he and his companion left, and Gideon heard the wagon moving out of the yard, and then there was quiet. He looked at Augusta. I am sorry you had to deal with that, he said. I have dealt with that kind of man before, she said. The flatness was gone from her voice now, replaced by something dry and clear. He thought I might be useful as a kind of argument. Women in positions of employment are sometimes used that way, as evidence of a man's reasonable character or as a point of persuasion. Did he say something to make you uncomfortable? Gideon asked. She considered the question seriously, the way she always considered things before answering. He implied that my situation here might be improved upon, she said. It was said casually. The kind of suggestion a man like that makes casually, knowing it puts a woman in the position of having to respond carefully regardless of what she thinks of the suggestion. Gideon was quiet for a moment. What did you think of the suggestion? She looked at him with those steady eyes. I thought that my situation here is not one I am looking to improve upon, she said. I thought that I am here because I chose to be, and that is, in itself, an improvement on a great many situations. Something in him settled when she said this, the way a horse settles when it finds firm ground after uncertain footing. I'm glad, he said. And then, because he had been thinking about something for 2 weeks and this moment had a kind of clarity that felt like it was asking him to stop being careful and start being honest, he said, Mrs. Prescott. Augusta. He said her name and then stopped, because he had been so careful about names, and this felt like a crossing. She looked at him, and her expression had shifted into something attentive and still, the stillness of someone who has heard a shift in tone and is listening carefully. I have been trying to find the right way to say something, he said. I haven't found the right way. I'm going to say it directly instead and hope that directness is acceptable. Directness is always acceptable, she said, and the faintest thing that was not quite a smile was in her voice. I am not a man who makes a habit of speaking about what he feels, he said. But I have been living in this house with you for 2 months, and I have been watching you move through it and listening to you and thinking about you considerably more than is probably appropriate given the nature of the arrangement, and I have arrived at a conclusion that I think you should know about. She was very still. I think you are remarkable, he said. I think you are the most capable and honest and interesting person I have met in my life, and I would like, if you are willing, to know you better. Not as your employer, as a man who is asking whether you might be willing to let him court you." The word court came out of him with the slight awkwardness of a word that is right but being spoken by a man not practiced in speaking it, and he was aware of the awkwardness, and he saw her register it, and whatever was in her face now was more complex than he could fully read in a single moment. She was quiet for what felt like a long time. He waited, because he had asked a real question and she deserved the space to give a real answer. "You have been thinking about this for a while," she said. It was not a question. 2 weeks, he said, properly thinking before that less clearly. "And you asked Clem for advice," she said. He blinked. Clem said very little. Clem said, "Shame to lose a good woman when a man has the means to keep her around," she said. "I was in the kitchen. The window was open." He was quiet for a moment. Then, to his own surprise, he laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes up from somewhere genuine and does not ask permission, and she looked at him with those eyes that were very nearly gold in the late afternoon light, and the corners of her mouth moved. "I should have known," he said. "You should," she agreed. And then, in that voice that he had been carrying around since October like a song he could not stop hearing, she said, "I am willing, Mr. Dawson. Gideon, if you are asking honestly." "I am asking honestly," he said. "Then I think," she said, "that we ought to see what that looks like." What it looked like in the weeks that followed was something that was easy in the way that things that fit together naturally are easy, not without effort but without the particular effort of things that do not belong together. They had already built the habits of easy company, the morning coffee and the shared meals, and the side-by-side work of the house and the ranch. What changed was what they said inside of those habits, which became more, and what they did not say, which became less. He took her to the church social in Millhaven in the second week of December, which was an event of sufficient local significance that it produced a number of observations from the assembled Millhaven population. The widow Parsons, Augusta's aunt, who was a small, sharp-eyed woman of 65 with an enormous capacity for information gathering, looked at Gideon for a long moment when they arrived and then looked at Augusta and said, "Well," in a tone that managed to convey satisfaction, reservation, and maternal authority simultaneously. Augusta introduced him properly, and the widow Parsons offered her hand, and Gideon shook it, and she said, "Mr. Dawson. My niece is not a woman who makes impractical choices. See to it that you give her no reason to doubt that this is a practical one." She said this directly and without softening it, and Gideon appreciated the directness, because it reminded him of someone. "Yes, ma'am," he said. The widow Parsons looked at him for another moment and then said, "Good. Now go get some of that punch before the Holloway boys drink it all," and went back to her conversation. And Augusta, beside him, said quietly, "She likes you," and he said, "How can you tell?" And she said, "She told you to drink the punch. She told the last man who came around to mind the door." And he laughed again, and she smiled. And across the room Tom Holloway caught his eye and looked pleased in the satisfied way of a man who feels that the universe is conducting itself properly. Christmas came to the Double D that year in a way it had not come in a very long time, which is to say, it was visible. Augusta found the box of decorations that had been in the back of the storage closet since his mother's time, dried orange pomanders and paper chains, and 2 good candles that had survived their storage remarkably well, and she put them up in the parlor and the kitchen with Clem's assistance. Clem standing on the step stool, with the cheerful incompetence of a man following instructions, and the house looked like it was celebrating something. On Christmas Eve, Gideon came into the parlor after supper and found her at the piano that stood in the corner, which had been his mother's piano and which had not been played in more than a decade. He had not known she could play. She was playing something quiet, a carol, her hands moving on the keys with the ease of someone who had learned young and had not forgotten. And she was not singing, but she might as well have been, because the music had the same quality as her voice, clear and considered and exactly itself. He stood in the doorway and listened until she finished, and then she turned and saw him there, and she did not look startled or embarrassed, only looked at him with that steady gaze and said, "Your mother's, I think." "The piano." "Yes," he said. "It has a lovely tone," she said. "It needs tuning, but the tone is lovely." He came into the room and sat in the chair nearest the piano. "Will you play something else?" he asked. She turned back to the keys and played another carol, and then another, and the lamp on the table sent its warm circle of light across the room, and outside the Panhandle winter held the world in its cold and quiet hands. And inside this house there was music and warmth and the feeling of something that was settling into itself, with the permanence of something built to last. He proposed to her on a Sunday in January. He had thought about how to do it, and he had concluded, characteristically, that the right approach was the direct one, because she was a person who valued directness and who would be made uncomfortable by elaborate ceremony for its own sake. He had also concluded that he needed to have the conversation outside of the house, because the house had an employment dimension to it that he wanted to be clearly separate from what he was about to say. He asked her to walk with him on Sunday afternoon, which was a time they had taken to using for the garden planning, discussing what would go where when spring came. The winter sun was thin and pale, but it was out, and the air was cold but still, and they walked along the fence line of the south pasture with their breath making small clouds, and he stopped at the place where the land rose slightly and you could see the house and the barn and the long reach of the ranch in one view. "I want to ask you something," he said. She stopped beside him and looked at the view, and then at him with that listening quality. "I am not a man who has much practice with this," he said. "But I know what I know, and I know that I want to spend my life with you. Not as your employer, not as a man who admires you from a respectful distance, but as your husband. If you will have me." She looked at him for a moment. The hazel eyes were clear and steady in the pale winter light. "You have thought about this for a while," she said again. "Since about November," he said. "I was going to say something in December, but then Morse came and the timing felt wrong. Then I waited for Christmas to pass. Then I thought January is as good a month as any." "Gideon," she said. He loved the way she said his name with that particular quality of precision, as if the name itself meant something when she used it. "Yes," he said. "I have been thinking about it since November as well," she said. "Since the evening you helped with the dishes." He looked at her. "The dishes? A man who helps with the dishes without being asked and without making a performance of it," she said, "is a man who has thought about what it means to share a life with someone. I noticed it then." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Is that a yes?" "That is a yes," she said, and there was something in her voice then, underneath the clarity and the precision, something warm and certain, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard, and he had been hearing it since October, and now it was saying yes, and he reached out and took her hand, which was cold in the January air, and held it. They were married in March of 1879, on the 20th, a Saturday, at the First Methodist Church in Millhaven, which was the church Augusta had been attending with her aunt since September, and which the Reverend Alcott presided over with the practiced warmth of a man who genuinely enjoys performing the ceremony that most directly embodies the idea that life contains things worth celebrating. The widow Parsons sat in the front pew and cried, which she did with the same dignified completeness with which she did everything else. Clem Hooper wore the coat he kept for funerals and other significant occasions, and sat in the second pew beside Pete Rafferty, who had borrowed a tie from somewhere, and was wearing it with the expression of a man fulfilling a social obligation cheerfully, but at personal cost. Tom Holloway and his wife were there, and a number of the Millhaven families that Augusta had come to know in the months she had lived with her aunt. Augusta wore a dress of ivory wool that her aunt had helped her make over the winter from a bolt of fabric bought from Tom's store, fitted simply, with a high neck and long sleeves against the March cold, and her hair pinned up with care but without excessive architecture. She carried a small bunch of dried lavender from the widow Parsons' garden, because there were no fresh flowers in March in the Panhandle, but there was lavender, dried and preserved from the summer, still carrying its scent. Gideon stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle on her aunt's arm, because the widow Parsons had the bearing of a woman fully capable of walking someone down an aisle with whatever authority the moment required. And he thought that she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, not in a way that surprised him, because he had been looking at her for 5 months, but in a way that arrived with the clarity of something confirmed. When she stood beside him, she looked up at him with those hazel eyes, and they were very bright, and he thought she might be holding something very carefully in place, which was what she did instead of showing everything at once, and he wanted to tell her that she did not have to hold it, but the Reverend Alcott had begun speaking, and there would be time for that later. There was time for everything later. That was the remarkable thing about the yes she had given him. It had turned everything that had been a finite question into an infinite answer. They said their vows in the clear voices of people who meant them, and the Reverend Alcott pronounced them husband and wife, and Gideon took her face in both his hands and kissed her, and the widow Parsons produced a sound that was simultaneously a cry and a cheer, and several other things at once, and Clem said something quietly to Pete Rafferty that produced a snort, and Tom Holloway's wife clapped. And outside the church, the March wind was blowing hard from the north, but inside it was warm and full of life. They went back to the Double D that afternoon, and the ranch hands had, in the way of ranch hands who feel that occasions require something, hung a banner on the barn that read congratulations spelled out in letters of varying size and success, which Pete Rafferty had painted on a piece of lumber with the fence paint, and which was visible from the road if you knew what it said. Augusta looked at it for a moment and then said, "That is the finest banner I have ever seen." And she meant it completely, without irony, and Pete Rafferty looked as if he might actually vibrate with satisfaction. They had a wedding supper in the kitchen that evening, the widow Parsons having arrived in advance to oversee the preparations with the focused energy of a woman who expresses love through food and organization. And it was a supper of abundance, roast chicken and potatoes, and 3 kinds of pie, which the widow Parsons considered the appropriate number of pies for a wedding. And they ate and talked, and the house was full of warmth and noise, and the particular quality of happiness that comes from things being, finally, exactly as they should be. Later, when the widow Parsons had been sent home in Tom Holloway's wagon, and the hands had retired to the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet again, Gideon and Augusta sat together in the parlor in the lamplight, and she had taken the pins from her hair, which he had not seen before, and it fell around her shoulders in the dark auburn that the lamplight turned to something deeper, and she looked like herself but more so. The version of herself that existed without the careful formal arrangements required by the public world. "Well," she said, "we are married." "We are," he said. "That is a remarkable fact," she said, not as if it were surprising but as if she were taking its measure, holding it up to see its full dimensions. "It is," he said. He was looking at her with the quiet attention that had been looking at her since October, that quality of listening that she had first produced in him with a voice through an open door, and she met his eyes with those eyes that were warm and golden in the lamplight, and she said, "I believe I am very happy, Gideon." "So am I," he said. And he was, in the solid and uncomplicated way of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was going, and found that it is exactly right. Spring came to the Double D like a gift being unwrapped slowly. The garden that Augusta had started in October and planned through the winter grew into something real as March and April advanced. The beds turned and amended with compost she had been managing since November. The seeds she had ordered from the catalog, starting in the small pots she kept on the south-facing windowsill in the kitchen. Gideon built her a cold frame from spare lumber, following her specifications exactly, which she had drawn out in that pocket notebook in a diagram of competent precision. They worked together on Saturdays in the garden, as they had before, but with the difference that was the difference marriage makes to everything: the removal of the careful outer layer of comportment and the revelation of the more ordinary, more genuine self that exists underneath it. She was funny, he discovered, in a dry and exact way that only emerged when she was comfortable. And she was stubborn about certain things in a way that was occasionally maddening and always interesting. And she had opinions about the proper organization of the root cellar that she held with a conviction usually reserved for theological positions. And she made the best coffee he had ever had in his life, which she attributed to the quality of the water, and which he privately attributed to some quality of hers that she transferred to everything she put her hands on. He was, she discovered, capable of extraordinary patience in some areas and extraordinary impatience in others, and the areas did not always align with what she would have predicted. He was patient with difficult cattle and impatient with difficult people, patient with long projects and impatient with preventable inefficiencies. He was also, which she had suspected but had the chance to confirm fully only now, genuinely kind, not in the demonstrative way that announces itself, but in the consistent, practical way that simply never does the unkind thing when the kind one is available. She loved him. She had known this, had recognized it as it built through the winter with the quiet inevitability of something organic growing in good conditions. But she had not let herself say it, in her internal life or anywhere else, until after the wedding, because she was careful with words and especially careful with that word. But she said it to herself in the spring in the garden, one morning in April when he came out of the barn and walked across the yard with Ranger's bridle over his arm, his hat set back slightly on his head, squinting against the bright spring light, and she looked at him and thought, "I love this man." And it was so simple and so true that it felt like it had always been true, and had only needed this particular April morning to say itself. She told him that evening. They were on the porch after supper, watching the sunset do what Panhandle sunsets do, which is to proceed with the complete confidence of a spectacle that knows it is remarkable and sees no reason to be modest about it. And she said, "Gideon, I love you." He turned to look at her, and she saw something move through his face that was not surprise exactly, but was the expression of a man hearing something he has been waiting to hear without knowing quite how much he was waiting. "I love you too," he said. "I've been wanting to say that for a while." "How long?" she said. "December," he said, "at the church social, when you told me your aunt liked me." She looked at him for a moment and then she laughed, and her laugh, which he had been collecting like a man who finds gold, had the quality of her voice but warmer, more open, the sound of someone who is fully where they are and finds it good. And he reached over and took her hand and they sat together on the porch while the Panhandle sky went orange and red, and then the deep violet of dusk, and the first stars came out one by one, and the evening was very quiet and very good. In the summer of 1879, Augusta discovered she was pregnant. She told Gideon on a July morning, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and the particular directness she brought to every piece of information she considered important, watching his face. He was quiet for a moment, and then something happened in his expression that she had not seen before, a complete and unguarded openness, the face of a man responding to something before he has had time to manage the response, and it was one of the most beautiful things she had seen in her life. "A baby," he said. "It appears so," she said. "I am fairly certain. The signs are consistent." He got up from the table and came around to her and crouched beside her chair so that he was looking at her at eye level, with the same attention he always brought to things that were important, and he took both her hands in his and he said, "Are you well? How are you feeling?" "I am feeling entirely well," she said, "slightly more tired than usual, but well." "We should get you to the doctor," he said. "We should," she agreed. "But first, perhaps sit down and have your coffee. You have not had your coffee." He looked at her for a moment and then he smiled, the full smile that she had first seen in December and had since then learned to treasure the way you treasure things that are rare. And he said, "You are the most sensible person I have ever known." And she said, "I know," and he laughed, which was exactly the right response. Dr. Harlan Briggs in Millhaven confirmed the pregnancy and pronounced Augusta healthy and the situation uncomplicated, and gave Gideon a list of sensible precautions in the serious manner of a doctor who has attended enough frontier births to have strong opinions about things being done properly. Gideon listened with the focused attention of a man who is taking notes internally and intends to follow every instruction precisely. He fussed, in the quiet way that was characteristic of him, without making a production of it, but by being constantly attentive. He moved certain things in the kitchen so they required less reaching. He checked the steps from the porch daily for any irregularity. He was at the kitchen door every evening before she could carry anything that was at all heavy. Augusta found this endearing and occasionally excessive, and told him so. In the direct way she told him everything, and he listened and modified his approach with the reasonable compromise of a man who understands the principle, but is not entirely willing to abandon the practice. Clem took the news with the deep satisfaction of a man who had been watching something develop since the first Monday. He saw the woman arrive at the Double D with a covered pot of stew and the capacity to reorganize a kitchen. He shook Gideon's hand and said, "Good thing, boss," which was as much as Clem said about most things of importance, and it was enough. The fall and winter of 1879 passed in the warmth of a house that was busy and purposeful, Augusta managing the domestic life of the ranch with the same focused energy she brought to everything, adapting as necessary to the changes her body was going through, and refusing to be incapacitated by what she referred to as the ordinary requirements of the process. She taught herself to do more from a sitting position, which Gideon built her a better chair for, a proper rocking chair from the lumber yard in Millhaven, wide and sturdy, which he carried up the porch steps himself and placed in the parlor by the fireplace, and which she regarded with the expression of someone who is moved but is holding it carefully. "It is a very good chair," she said. "It should be comfortable," he said. "You're going to be spending a lot of time in it." "I am not going to spend more time sitting down than is reasonable," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you aren't, but when you do sit down it should be a good chair." She looked at him for a moment and then she reached out and took his hand, which she did now with the ease of a woman who has fully inhabited the fact of belonging with someone, and she said, "It is a very good chair," and she meant more than the chair. Their son was born on the 17th of February, 1880, in the front bedroom of the Double D Ranch house, with Dr. Briggs attending and the widow Parsons present in a supporting capacity that involved a great deal of purposeful movement and the issuance of instructions to everyone including the doctor. It was a long night, and Gideon spent most of it in the kitchen performing the useless acts of a worried man, making coffee he did not drink and walking to the bedroom door and back without opening it, until Dr. Briggs came out and said that Augusta was well and the child was well and he could go in. He went in. She was in the bed, pale and tired with the particular exhaustion of enormous effort, and she was holding a bundle that was, on closer inspection, a baby, a real baby, with his mother's dark hair already visible on the top of his small head, and a face that was working through a range of expressions with the uncurated intensity of someone who has recently arrived in the world and has not yet decided what to make of it. Augusta looked up at Gideon when he came in, and her eyes were bright with tiredness and with something else, the same unguarded openness she had produced in him the previous July, and she said, "Come and meet your son." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who looked back at him with the unfocused but intent gaze of a newborn, as if he were conducting his own initial assessment. "He looks like you," Augusta said. "God help him," Gideon said. She laughed, tiredly but genuinely, and he leaned forward and kissed her forehead, which was warm and slightly damp, and he stayed there for a moment, his forehead resting against hers, and he thought that the world contained more than he had ever expected it to contain, and that the beginning of that more had started with a voice he could not stop hearing through an open door in October of 1878. They named him Thomas Robert Dawson. Thomas for Gideon's father and Robert for Augusta's first husband, because Augusta said, "Robert was a decent man and he deserves to be remembered, and I see no reason why a name cannot hold two people at once," which was so exactly and typically her that Gideon agreed immediately. Thomas Robert Dawson was a healthy and serious infant who regarded the world with an intensity that suggested he was going to have opinions about it as soon as he developed the vocabulary. The Double D in the spring of 1880 was a different place than the Double D of October 1878, in the way that places are different when they are inhabited by a life, rather than a man simply existing in one. The garden was producing, the curtains were clean, the kitchen smelled like coffee and bread. There was a baby in the house and a woman's voice moving through the rooms, and Clem Hooper had started taking all his meals at the kitchen table, which no one commented on because it was the natural progression of things. Franklin Morse made one more appearance that spring, driving past the Double D on the way to another property he was attempting to acquire, and he stopped at the gate, which was as far as he was going to get without an invitation, and Gideon went out to speak with him. Morse had heard, in the way that men like Morse hear things, that Gideon had married. He offered his congratulations with the smoothness of a man who means them in the most general way. He mentioned the south pasture one more time, almost as a habit, and Gideon said no, one more time without preamble, and Morse nodded with the philosophical acceptance of a man who has run out of approaches and knows it, and drove on. Augusta, who had seen this exchange from the porch, waited until Morse's wagon was out of sight and then said, "Is that resolved?" "I expect so," Gideon said. "Good," she said, with the finality of a woman closing a chapter, and went back inside. In the summer of 1880, the widow Parsons, whose health had been declining with the quiet persistence of a woman who refuses to acknowledge this but cannot entirely prevent its effects, came to live at the Double D. It was Augusta who proposed it, directly and without preamble, sitting across from Gideon at the kitchen table one evening in June. "My aunt cannot manage alone much longer," she said. "Her hip is worse, and she has no one to look after the house. I would like to bring her here." "Of course," Gideon said. She looked at him for a moment. "You did not have to agree that quickly." "I know," he said. "But it's the right thing, and you knew I would see that, and you would not have asked if you were not certain." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You know me very well." "I have been paying attention," he said. The widow Parsons came in July, in a wagon loaded with the accumulated possessions of a long life, including a cast-iron stove that she declared superior to the one at the Double D, and that was installed in her room, a crate of books, an alarming collection of dried herbs, and a cat named Justice who was gray and opinionated, and who immediately established dominance over the household with the self-possession of a creature that has never doubted its own authority. The widow Parsons, in the way of difficult women who find themselves in good circumstances, was not a convenient house guest. She had views on the proper temperature of a house, the appropriate use of the parlor, and the schedule by which meals should be served, and she expressed these views with the clarity she had always expressed everything. But she also read to the baby in the evenings, in a voice that had something of Augusta's quality to it, which made sense because Augusta had spent childhood summers with her aunt and had picked up more than she perhaps knew, and the baby Thomas listened to this with the focused intensity he brought to everything and seemed to find it deeply agreeable. Clem Hooper and the widow Parsons developed a relationship that was approximately equal parts mutual exasperation and mutual respect, which manifested primarily in arguments about the proper management of the kitchen garden, in which they both had strong opinions, and which Augusta observed with the serene amusement of a woman who knows exactly how this is going to end, and is content to let it run its course. It ended, as she had predicted, with a détente that resembled a working partnership and was, in practice, responsible for the Double D kitchen garden becoming the most productive in the county by the autumn of 1880. By 1881, the Double D was, in every sense that mattered, a home. The house had been repaired and repainted, the fences were in good order, the cattle were healthy, and the ranch was turning a profit that allowed Gideon to make the improvements he had been planning for years, including a proper water tank for the south well that made the question of that access land permanently moot, which he mentioned to no one in particular, but which felt like a satisfying conclusion to a chapter he had not enjoyed. Augusta was pregnant again by the late spring of 1881, which she discovered with the same directness she brought to all important information, and told Gideon at the kitchen table over coffee with the same watching attention. This time he was across the table and had hold of her hands before she finished the sentence, and she looked at him with those eyes that still did the thing they had always done to him, that quality of seeing him entirely and meeting him exactly where he was, and she said, "We are getting good at this," and he said, "At what?" And she said, "At being happy," and he thought that was the most exactly right thing he had ever heard in his life, and he had been listening to her say exactly right things since October of 1878, standing at a hitching post in Millhaven while her voice came through an open door, and rearranged something in him that had never been arranged quite right before. Their daughter was born in January of 1882, in the same room and with the same attendants, and she arrived with considerably more enthusiasm and considerably less time than Thomas had required, which Dr. Briggs described as efficient. She had her mother's eyes and her father's coloring, which was a combination that was going to be remarkable when she grew into it, and she had, from the first hours of her life, a voice that carried. Augusta, when Gideon observed this from the doorway of the bedroom in the particular tone of a man registering a characteristic, said, "A voice that carries is not a problem. It is an asset. Make sure she knows that." They named her Eleanor Margaret Dawson. Eleanor because Augusta had always loved the name, and Margaret for no particular reason except that it suited her, and she was called Ellie from the first week because Thomas, at 2 years old, produced that version of it, and it stuck with the permanence of early words. Thomas loved his sister with the wholehearted concentration he brought to everything he loved, and Ellie regarded her brother with the tolerant superiority of a younger sibling, who suspects she has arrived to a situation she is fully capable of managing. Clem Hooper could be found, on many winter evenings, sitting in the kitchen with one child on each knee, telling them stories about horses and cattle and the geography of the Panhandle, with the focused seriousness of a man who understands that children deserve to be told true things. The widow Parsons taught them both to read before they were of an age to start the school that was established in Millhaven in 1883, a development that Augusta had lobbied for quietly but persistently over 2 years, writing letters and attending town meetings, and making the case with the clear precision of a woman who knows what she is arguing for and why. The school opened in September of 1883 with 14 students and a teacher named Miss Clara Webb, who had come from Ohio with a degree from a normal school and the particular combination of idealism and practicality required by frontier education. Pete Rafferty married in 1882, a local girl named Annie whose family had a small farm 5 miles west of the Double D, and they came to supper at the ranch once a month, which Augusta organized with the same quiet efficiency she organized everything, and which became one of the rhythms of the ranch's social life. Those monthly suppers, the Raffertys and Clem and sometimes Tom Holloway and his wife, gathered around the big kitchen table that Gideon had built in the spring of 1880 when the old one became inadequate, the table long enough for 10 if you sat close, and filled with food and talk, and the particular quality of community that comes from people who know each other in the way of having been through things together. Gideon, on an evening in the spring of 1884, sat on the porch after one of those suppers, when the guests had gone and the children were in bed, and the widow Parsons had retired and Clem had gone to the bunkhouse, and Augusta came out and sat beside him with her coffee, which was a thing they had done so many thousands of times now that it was as natural as breathing and as sustaining. The Panhandle spring was doing what it did, which was to produce, in its brief window between winter and the full heat of summer, a particular beauty that justified everything the harder seasons cost. The sky was very clear, and the stars were the particular blazing stars of the Texas sky, undiluted by anything that was not itself, and the night smelled of the grass coming up and the cedar in the distance and the coffee in their cups. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was actually thinking, which she could tell from the quiet when he was not actually thinking. "October," he said. She waited. "October of 1878, he said. "Standing at the hitching post outside Tom Holloway's store, hearing your voice before I saw you." She was quiet for a moment. "What was I saying?" "You were telling Tom that the bread either rises or it does not, and no amount of flattery to the baker changes the nature of yeast." She laughed softly in the night. "I remember that. I stood there and listened," he said, "and I could not stop thinking about your voice. All the way home and for 3 days after, I kept telling myself I was thinking about the fence line and the water situation and the cattle prices." "You were not," she said. "I was not," he admitted. "I was thinking about your voice." She was quiet for a moment, and then she set her hand on his on the arm of the rocking chair, and he turned his hand over and held hers, which was warm and sure, the hand of a woman who had made bread and kept accounts and planted gardens and raised children and run a household and built a life out of what was available, and it was the most familiar and most extraordinary thing he held. "I am glad you went to town that day," she said. "So am I," he said. "I am glad you needed a housekeeper," she said. "The kitchen floor was a problem," he said. "The kitchen floor was genuinely alarming," she said, in the dry, exact tone that he still found, 6 years later, as compelling as the first time he heard it through an open door. "It had a personality." He laughed. She laughed. And out over the Panhandle, the stars did what they had been doing for an eternity before Gideon Dawson rode to Millhaven for a housekeeper, and came home unable to stop thinking about a voice, and what they would keep doing long after, which was to burn bright and true in the great dark, indifferent to the particular and not so particular arrangements of the people beneath them, and entirely unconcerned with the remarkable fact that a man's life can be rearranged by a voice through an open door on an October morning in 1878. The night was long and good. The house behind them was quiet with the particular quiet of a house full of sleeping people, the kind of quiet that is not empty but full, the way a vessel is full even when still, holding all that it contains without spilling. Thomas was asleep in his room with his arm around the stuffed horse Clem had carved for his birthday, and Ellie was asleep in her crib with the absolute conviction of a child who has decided sleep is worth committing to, and the widow Parsons was asleep in her room with Justice the cat on the foot of her bed, and the house held them all. Augusta looked out at the stars and felt, as she had come to feel on these evenings that were now 1,000 or more in their accumulation, the particular rightness of being exactly where she was, which was a thing she had not always been able to feel, which had required arriving at this place, which had required all the difficulty of the years before it, the loss and the hard labor of rebuilding, and she was grateful for those years in the way that you are grateful for the hard thing that brought you to the good thing. Not glad it happened, but glad that it led here. She had come to Millhaven with a single trunk and a covered pot of stew and the intention of finding her footing, and she had found something she had not precisely been looking for, which is the way the best findings usually go. She had found a house that became a home, and a man who listened when she spoke, and a life that held in every ordinary and extraordinary day of it the fullness she had not dared to want when fullness seemed so far from reach. "Gideon," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm very glad the bread rises," she said. He was quiet for a moment, And then he understood what she meant, which was what she always meant when she said the seemingly small thing which was the whole of it, and he said, "So am I, Augusta. So am I." And they sat together on the porch of the Double D Ranch in the spring of 1884, on the Panhandle of Texas, under the stars, and the night was around them and the house was behind them and the whole of their life was in that, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was exactly everything. In the years that followed, the Double D continued to prosper, and the family at its heart continued to grow in the ways that families grow, not only in number but in depth, in the accumulated texture of shared years, and the particular knowing that comes only from time. Clem Hooper finally retired from ranch work in 1886, when his rheumatism made the harder work impossible, and he moved into the house proper, into the room at the back that had once been Augusta's, and became what he had effectively been for years, which was family, taking his meals at the big kitchen table and playing checkers with Thomas in the evenings, and telling Ellie stories about the early days of the ranch with the faithful accuracy of a man who considers memory an obligation. Augusta became, in the community of Millhaven and the surrounding county, the kind of woman that communities build themselves around without necessarily knowing that is what they are doing. She was a steady presence at the school committee, which worked to keep Miss Clara Webb's salary adequate to the actual cost of living, a quieter advocacy than the one that had established the school, but equally necessary. She organized a lending library out of the back room of Tom Holloway's store, 34 books the first year and growing, and she taught reading to 3 women on the Rafferty Farms neighboring property who had not had the opportunity as children. And she did these things with the same matter-of-fact energy she brought to the kitchen garden, as if the natural thing to do with what you have is to share it. Gideon, watching her move through the world, had never once stopped hearing her voice with the particular attention it had commanded in him since that first October morning. It was still what it had always been, clear and precise and exactly itself, and it still did what it had always done, which was to make everything it touched a little more real, a little more present, a little more worth attending to. He had spent 12 years by 1890 listening to it, and he had not exhausted it yet, and he did not expect to. Thomas Dawson grew into a serious, capable boy, and then into a young man of 12 who could manage a horse as well as any hand on the ranch, and who had, to no one's particular surprise, a gift for numbers that expressed itself in the ranch accounts. He began keeping in a ledger of his own at the age of 10, checking his figures against his father's with the quiet competitiveness of a person who is going to be very good at something, and knows it. He had his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, which was a combination that suggested the Double D was in good hands for the future. Ellie was 8 and incandescent, with a voice that did indeed carry and opinions that she expressed with the directness of someone who had learned at her mother's table that directness is a virtue, and a particular attachment to Justice the cat, who was old now and moved slowly, but regarded Ellie with the tolerant affection of an elder who has found their successor. She was going to be extraordinary, and everyone at the Double D knew it, and they said so regularly enough that she accepted it as simply accurate and got on with the business of being extraordinary, which mostly involved reading everything in the lending library and asking questions that required considerable thought to answer. On an October morning in 1890, 12 years and a few days after Gideon had first ridden to Millhaven with a practical purpose and come home rearranged, he rode to town again, for supplies, for the ordinary errands of a running ranch, and he stopped at Tom Holloway's store, which was still there and still operated by Tom, who was older now and had taken on his nephew to help with the heavier work, but who still stood behind the counter, with the same mild satisfaction of a man who knows his place in the community and finds it good. Tom greeted him and they talked for a while about the usual things, and when Gideon was about to leave, Tom said, with the expression of a man who has been saving a thing to say, "You know, Gideon, I remember when you came in here in October of '78 and asked to post that notice." "I remember," Gideon said. "You should have seen your face," Tom said, "when you heard her voice and then saw her for the first time. A man doesn't usually look quite like that over a stranger." "I didn't know what I was looking like," Gideon said. "No," Tom agreed. "Men seldom do in those moments." He smiled in the satisfied way he had smiled at the wedding. "I like to think I had some part in it, having kept her name ready to offer when you asked." "I expect you did," Gideon said, and they shook hands, and he rode home. Augusta was in the garden when he came back, the autumn garden that was smaller now than the summer one but still producing, the late tomatoes and the squash and the herbs she dried for winter use. She was wearing the old hat she wore in the garden, a battered thing that had long since lost any relationship to fashion and had acquired instead a relationship to usefulness. And she was examining a vine with the focused attention of someone who is assessing whether the vine has made its best decisions. She looked up when Ranger came into the yard, and she raised one hand in acknowledgement, the gesture of a woman who is busy but is glad you are home, which is a gesture that contains everything. And Gideon dismounted and turned Ranger out and walked across the yard toward the garden. And she straightened from the vine and looked at him with those hazel eyes that were still what they had always been, the color of the Panhandle afternoon, shifting between green and brown in the light and very clear. "Good trip." She said. "Good trip," he said. "Tom Holloway says hello." "Tell him hello back," she said. "He should come to supper one of these weeks. It has been a while." "I'll tell him," Gideon said. He stopped beside her at the garden fence and looked at what she had been doing, and she showed him the vine's situation. And they talked about the vine with the seriousness of people who have worked a garden together long enough to take vines seriously. And then they stood for a moment in the October afternoon that was exactly like that first October and nothing like it at all. Because this October had 12 years in it and 2 children, and a household that worked, and the widow Parsons inside reading to Ellie and Thomas coming up the drive from school with his boots dusty and his head down in thought. And all of it was here. All of it had grown from that morning, from that voice, from a man who could not stop hearing it. "Augusta," he said. She looked at him. "I rode past the spot where Tom posted the notice," he said. "There's a different notice there now, something about a town meeting, but I thought about it." She waited because she knew he was going somewhere. 12 years ago," he said, "I came to town to find a housekeeper." "You did," she said. "I found considerably more than a housekeeper," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she smiled fully, the smile that still did what it had always done, and she said, "I believe the term you are looking for is everything, Gideon. You found everything." He looked at her, at the hazel eyes and the firm jaw and the hair that was still that dark auburn now touched at the temples with the first silver that she wore with the same lack of apology she had always worn everything. And he thought that yes, that was the term, and that he had been finding it every day for 12 years, and that he intended to keep finding it for every day that remained. "I did," he said. "I found everything." Thomas reached the garden fence and greeted them both with the brief efficiency of a 12-year-old who has more internal thoughts than time to express them, and went inside where Ellie's voice could already be heard rising in the particular register that meant she had something to tell him. And the widow Parsons called from inside for someone to put on the kettle. And Justice, the old cat, appeared on the porch railing and regarded the yard with ancient authority. And the October sun lay long and golden over the Double D, over the house and the barn and the pecan tree that was dropping its leaves in the slow, unhurried way of a thing that knows it has done this before and will do it again. And everything was exactly as it was, and it was entirely, completely, permanently good.